Abigail Carter slammed her father's foreclosure notice onto the table and walked out the door, not to beg, not to cry, but to face the most feared man in Shenandoah County and tell him exactly what 30 women before her had been too afraid to say. She had nothing left to lose. That made her the most dangerous person in the room. If you've ever been written off by someone who mistook silence for weakness, this story was made for you. Subscribe, stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this story travels. The summer of 1817 arrived in Shenandoah Valley, the way it always did, heavy and unrelenting, pressing down on every living thing, like a hand that would not lift. The tobacco fields shimmered in the heat. The creek behind the Carter property ran low. And Abigail Carter, 24 years old, stood at the edge of what remained of her father's land, and read the same letter for the third time that morning, as though the words might change if she looked long enough. They did not change. $73. That was the number. $73 owed to Edmund Hale, the county's most prominent moneylender, due by the 1st of September, or the Carter farm, all 42 acres of it, the house, the barn, the well, the peach trees her mother had planted the year Abigail was born, would be seized and sold at public auction. Her father, Joseph Carter, sat on the porch steps behind her. He hadn't spoken in 10 minutes. That silence was its own kind of verdict. "Power," she said, finally folding the letter. "How long have you known?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Since April." "It's July." "I know what month it is, Abigail." She turned to face him. He was a good man, Joseph Carter. Honest, slow to anger, slower to ask for help. Those qualities had served him poorly in a county where the powerful moved fast and the poor waited too long. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "Because I didn't want you carrying it." "I'm already carrying it, Pa. I've been carrying it since Mama died, and you stopped keeping the ledger." He flinched. She hadn't meant it to land that hard, but she didn't take it back. There wasn't time for soft truths anymore. She looked out at the field. "We have to go to the summer gathering at Hargrove Hall. Edmund Hale will be there, and so will Nathaniel Brooks." Joseph looked up sharply. "You leave Brooks out of this. He owns half the county. He sits on the lending committee. If anyone can apply pressure to Hale to extend the terms, I won't have my daughter going hat in hand to that man." Joseph stood, and even at 60, there was still iron in his frame. "You've heard what people say about him. He's run off every eligible woman in 3 counties. He thinks he's better than God Almighty and isn't shy about saying so. I'm not going to impress him," Abigail said. "I'm going to talk sense at him. There's a difference." Her father opened his mouth, closed it. Then he looked at her the way he sometimes did, the way that made her feel like she was simultaneously the bravest and most frightening thing he'd ever produced. "Don't make an enemy of him," was all he said. Hargrove Hall had belonged to the Hargrove family for 3 generations, and it showed wide porches, whitewashed columns, a dining room that could seat 40. In the summer, Thomas Hargrove opened the grounds to the county's social gatherings, which meant that every merchant, landowner, lawyer, and hopeful mother within 20 miles descended on the estate with their best clothes and their sharpest ambitions. Abigail arrived in a cotton dress that had been washed so many times the blue had faded nearly to gray. She had mended the hem twice. She had pressed it with a hot iron that morning until her arms ached. She wore her mother's small pearl earrings, which were real, and her only pair of good shoes, which were not quite. She did not look wealthy. She knew that. She had stopped pretending otherwise years ago. What she did, as she stepped into the main hall, was lift her chin, set her shoulders, and walk like a woman who was exactly where she intended to be. The room was full. Laughter and conversation, and the clink of glasses moved through the air like music. She recognized most of the faces, the Harrisons from the north end of the county, the Whitfield girls who had come out last spring, old Reverend Moss standing near the fireplace with a cup of something that was almost certainly not lemonade. And in the far corner of the room, surrounded by a loose circle of men and a tighter circle of women, stood Nathaniel Brooks. She had seen him before. Once at a distance riding through town on a black horse. Once at the county courthouse through a window speaking to Judge Alcott. She had never been this close. Hal was taller than she remembered. Dark-haired, weathered in the way of men who worked their own land despite owning enough of it to never touch a shovel. His jaw was set, like he was tolerating the conversation rather than enjoying it, and his eyes, dark, steady, unreadable, moved across the room with the slow, deliberate patience of a man accustomed to seeing everything. 3 women stood close to him, very close. One was laughing at something he hadn't said. One was touching her hair. The third was nodding at whatever the man beside him had just finished saying. Though it was clear from her expression that she hadn't heard a word of it, she was too busy watching Nathaniel to listen to anyone else. Abigail looked at all 3 of them. Then she looked at Nathaniel Brooks, who had just glanced up from his glass and met her eyes across the room. She did not look away. She did not smile. He tilted his head slightly the way a man does when something unexpected crosses his path. She moved toward the lemonade table and picked up a glass. She found Edmund Hale. 20 minutes later, near the side parlor, in conversation with 2 men she didn't recognize. He was a small man. Hale soft hands, careful eyes, a smile that arrived slightly after it should have, like a door on a slow hinge. "Miss Carter," he said when he saw her, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not warmth. Calculation. What a surprise. "Mr. Hale." She kept her voice level. "I'd like to speak with you about the terms on our loan. This is a social occasion. My father's farm is not a social matter." One of the men beside him raised his eyebrows. Hale's smile stayed in place, but went thin at the edges. "September 1st stands," he said quietly. "The terms were agreed upon. The drought cut our yield by 1/3 this summer. Every farmer in the valley can say the same. An extension of 30 days. Is not something I'm prepared to offer." He lifted his glass. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter. Truly." He didn't sound sorry. He sounded finished with the conversation. Abigail stood there for one long moment looking at him. She had known this was likely. She had known it and come anyway, because she had needed to hear it directly to know the door was shut before she found another one. She turned and walked back into the main room. She walked directly into Nathaniel Brooks. Not figuratively. Literally. She had been moving, and he had been moving, and they met at the edge of the hallway in a collision that sent her lemonade glass tilting sideways, saved from disaster only by her quick grip. "Excuse me," she said automatically. "My fault," he said. Then they both stopped. Up close he was even more composed than he had appeared from across the room. Not in a cold way. In the way of a man who had learned to contain himself out of necessity rather than indifference. There was something around his eyes, not softness exactly, but awareness, like he was always taking in more than he showed. "Miss," he began. "Carter," she said. "Abigail Carter." "I know who you are." That surprised her. She didn't show it. "Do you? Your father sold timber rights to Hargrove 3 years ago. You negotiated the contract on his behalf." Alcott mentioned it. Something in his expression shifted, not quite curiosity, but close. "He said you argued the price up by 15% before you signed." 20%, Abigail said. "Alcott misremembers." Nathaniel Brooks looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since she'd entered the room, something that might have been a real expression crossed his face. "Nathaniel Brooks," he said. "I know who you are," she said. He did not move on. That was the thing she noticed first. Every other man at this gathering had a destination, a next person to speak to, a purpose that would carry him away in 30 seconds or less. Nathaniel Brooks stood where he was and looked at her like he was in no hurry whatsoever. "You were speaking with Hale," he said. It was not a question. "He was declining to speak with me," she said. "There's a distinction." "What did you want from him?" "An extension on a loan." She had no particular reason to tell him, except that she had never found much use in pretending difficulties didn't exist. Pretending was expensive and she couldn't afford it. He declined, as expected. "Then why ask?" "Because you don't get what you don't ask for." She looked at him steadily. "And because sometimes the person who says no in the parlor changes his mind in the daylight when the county's watching." It was worth the attempt. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. That's a practical way to look at it. I'm a practical person, Mr. Brooks. You don't seem very distressed for someone who just got turned down on a significant matter. Would you prefer I cry? She asked. I can arrange it for later if it makes you more comfortable. At present, I'm still in the phase where I'm thinking of the next option. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them smiled, but something in the air between them shifted very slightly, like a door moving on a hinge. Miss Carter, he said, I have been attending these gatherings for 3 years. In that time I have had the same conversation approximately 40 times. How the weather is fine, how the tobacco looks promising, how my estate must require so much attention. He paused. You are the first person tonight who has said something I didn't already expect. I'll take that as a compliment, she said, since I suspect you don't offer many. I don't, he said simply. She didn't seek him out again that evening. She spoke with Reverend Moss, who was kind. She spoke with Martha Whitfield, who was nosy but well-intentioned. She ate a small plate of food and calculated quietly and privately. Whether there was any combination of the remaining summer harvest, the small savings she'd hidden under the kitchen floorboard, and whatever could be earned from taking in sewing between now and September, that could add up to $73. It did not add up. She was standing near the window when she heard it. 3 women just around the corner of the door, voices dropped but not enough. Carter girl, the one by the window. Joseph Carter's daughter. That family's finished. I heard Hale's taking the farm come September. She was talking to Brooks for nearly 10 minutes. Did you see? Laughter. Not kind. She's got nerve, I'll say that. But nerve doesn't buy a dress that fits. Did you see the hem on that thing? Probably thinks if she catches his eye, she can solve the debt problem in one evening. More laughter. Abigail stood at the window and did not move. She held her glass with both hands and looked at her own reflection in the dark glass and breathed slowly. She had heard worse. She would hear worse again. There was a kind of endurance required to be poor in a room full of people who weren't, and she had been developing it since she was 16 years old. She set her glass down and turned around. Nathaniel Brooks was standing 4 feet away from her. From the stillness of his face, she could not tell how much he had heard. But he had been there. That much was plain. Mr. Brooks, he said, because saying nothing would be worse. Miss Carter. He looked at her directly. I apologize for that. It isn't yours to apologize for. No, he agreed. But I'm doing it anyway. She studied him. Why? I was quiet for a long moment. Because someone should. She thought about that on the drive home, sitting beside her father on the wagon seat while the summer dark settled around them and the horses' hooves made their slow rhythm on the dirt road. Well, her father said, Hale won't extend. Joseph nodded once. And Brooks. I spoke with him briefly. Her father looked at her. Briefly. For perhaps 15 minutes. Abigail. I wasn't seeking his help, she said. We simply spoke. About what? She thought about the question. About timber contracts and Alcott and practical thinking and why people say things they didn't expect. About being practical, she said finally. Her father was quiet for a while. Then, what did you think of him? She looked at the road ahead of them. He's not what I expected. Is that good or bad? She didn't answer right away. The peach trees appeared on the left as they came around the last bend before home, dark shapes against the darker sky loaded with fruit that wouldn't be enough. I don't know yet, she said. What she did not know that night, what she couldn't have known, was that Nathaniel Brooks arrived home to his estate on the eastern ridge of the county and stood in his study for a long time without lighting the lamp. His housekeeper, Mrs. Good, had left supper on the sideboard. He didn't touch it. He had been to 14 of these gatherings in the past 3 years. He had spoken to women who were beautiful women, who were accomplished. Women who had been coached by their mothers on exactly what to say to a wealthy landowner and had delivered every line perfectly. He had been smiled at, flattered, performed for, and occasionally wept upon in the corner of more than one parlor, though never, he was fairly certain, by anyone who was genuinely distressed. He had tested all of them. Not openly, not cruelly. But he had learned after his father died, and the letters started arriving, and the invitations doubled and tripled, and the women who had barely known his name suddenly knew it very well. He had learned to watch, to wait, to see who agreed with everything he said and who pushed back, who laughed at things that weren't funny, who held their smile past the point where a real smile would have faded. 30 women in 3 years. Some of them were perfectly decent people, but none of them had said a word he didn't already know was coming. Abigail Carter had argued a timber contract up 20%. She had walked into Edmund Hale's conversation uninvited and made her case without apology. She had stood at that window and held herself still while people said what they said about her, and not flinched, not performed distress, not looked around to see who was watching. She had looked him in the eye and said, "I'll take that as a compliment, since I suspect you don't offer many." He stood in the dark study and thought about that for a long time. Then he sat down and wrote a note to Judge Alcott. He wanted to know more about the Carter property matter. September did not wait. Abigail had always known it wouldn't. She spent the weeks after the Hargrove gathering, doing everything she could think of, taking in mending from 4 households, selling eggs, speaking quietly to 2 of the families further up the valley about buying timber rights to the back corner of the property, a piece of land with good oak that she hadn't wanted to sell, but that she could not afford to protect any longer. The timber offer came back low. Too low. She sat at the kitchen table one evening in early August and did the numbers again. Then she did them a different way, in case the first way was wrong. It wasn't wrong. She looked up from the ledger. Her father was asleep in his chair by the cold fireplace, his chin on his chest, his breathing slow and even. He was 60 years old and looked 70, and there was gray in his hair that hadn't been there 2 summers ago. She thought about her mother, who had planted those peach trees the spring before Abigail was born, who had said Abigail had been told this. She had no memory of it herself. She had been 3 years old. These will feed us when times are hard. Times were hard. She closed the ledger. The letter arrived the next morning, delivered by a boy from town on a gray mare. No return name on the outside. Inside 2 sentences in a clean, economical hand. Miss Carter, I have spoken with Alcott regarding the lending committee. You may find the terms on the Hale loan open to renegotiation. N.B. She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in both hands and stood very still in the kitchen while the morning light came through the window and her father's coffee went cold on the stove. She did not feel relief. She felt something more complicated than relief. Something that sat between gratitude and wariness, because she had been around long enough to know that men with power who moved quietly on your behalf generally expected something in return. She wrote back that afternoon. Short. Direct. Mr. Brooks. I appreciate the information. I'd like to understand what motivated it. A.C. His reply came the following morning. Alcott told me the whole story. You negotiated that timber contract alone at 16 after your mother died, and your father couldn't. I find that I am curious about people who do things I don't expect. That is the only motivation I can honestly claim. N.B. She read that one 3 times. Then she wrote back. Curiosity is not a sufficient explanation for intervention on a stranger's behalf. He replied, You are not a stranger. You are the most direct person I have spoken to in 3 years. That distinction carries weight. She put the letter in the kitchen drawer under the mending receipts and went out to check on the east field because she did not know what to do with that sentence, and the field at least was a problem, she understood. It was her neighbor, Ruth Alcott, the judge's wife, a sharp-eyed woman who missed nothing and said everything, who came to call 4 days later with a basket of preserves and a significant expression. Nathaniel Brooks has been asking questions about you, Ruth said before she'd even set the basket down. What kind of questions? Abigail asked. The kind a man asks when he's interested. How long your family's been in the county. What you're like. Whether you have any understanding with any of the local men. Ruth set the basket on the table and looked at Abigail directly. My husband says he's never seen Brooks take a personal interest in any legal matter before. He keeps his distance from other people's business as a general rule. It may not be personal, Abigail said. He may simply object to Hale on principle. Ruth Alcott gave her a look that said clearly she thought that was the most unconvincing thing she had heard in some time. He sent word to 3 men on that lending committee, Abigail. 3. In the same week. That is not principle. That is purpose. Abigail was quiet. Now, Ruth said, sitting down at the table as though she owned it, which she very nearly did in spirit. I'm going to tell you what I know about Nathaniel Brooks. Not what the county gossips say, which is mostly invention. What I actually know. I didn't ask. No, but you're listening. Ruth folded her hands. His father, William Brooks, died in the winter of 1814. Nathaniel was 31. Before that death, Nathaniel was not warm, but engaged. He came to gatherings. He helped his neighbors. He was regarded as fair, which in this county is about as high a compliment as you'll get. Ruth paused. After his father died, he found out that a woman he had been keeping company with for the better part of a year had known about a significant portion of the estate's assets before anyone else did. Meaning someone had told her. Meaning she had been strategic. What happened? Abigail asked quietly. He ended it. She married a man in Richmond within 4 months. Ruth's expression went careful. He's been alone since 3 years. And in those 3 years, he has tested every woman who's come near him like he's waiting for someone to fail the test. Like he's half hoping they will. Abigail thought about the gathering. About the 3 women in that loose circle. About the way his eyes moved across the room with the patience of a man who was always watching. He expects everyone to want something from him, she said slowly. Yes, Ruth said. And he met you. Who wants nothing from him? I want an extension on a loan. Which you didn't ask him for, Ruth said. Which he provided without being asked. There's a difference. She picked up her basket. I'm not telling you what to do, child. I'm telling you what the situation is. Abigail did not go to him. She had made a decision about that quiet and firm sometime in the space between Ruth Alcott's visit and the following morning. She would not pursue him. Not because she had no respect for him, she was beginning to cautiously. The way you develop respect for a thing that keeps surprising you, but because she was not in a position to offer what pursuing him would imply. She had a farm to save. She had a father to look after. She had a life that was almost entirely composed of things she hadn't chosen and was managing anyway. She had no room for something she could not control. What she did do was answer his letters when they came. Because they kept coming. Not romantic letters, nothing of the kind. He wrote about the county, about the lending committee, about the drought's effect on the southern parcels of land. He wrote about a dispute between 2 neighboring farmers over a water easement, and asked almost as an aside whether she had any thoughts on how such matters were typically resolved when legal recourse was too expensive for both parties. She wrote back about the easement dispute with more detail than he'd probably expected. She had seen 3 such disputes in her 24 years. She knew how they ended when lawyers got involved badly, and how they ended when neighbors sat down at a table and worked it out mostly fine. She gave him her honest assessment. He replied that he had passed her analysis to the relevant parties, and they had reached a settlement within the week. You should have been a lawyer, he wrote. Women can't be lawyers, she wrote back. That is an extraordinary waste, he replied. She sat with that letter for a long time. Then she put it in the drawer with the others. On a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of August, she was in the barn, checking on the old mare's left foreleg, which had been swollen since Monday, and which she was beginning to fear would need a vet she could not afford when she heard a horse on the road. She did not look up immediately. She finished what she was doing. Then she stood and turned around. Nathaniel Brooks was dismounting at the gate. I was alone. No servant, no companion. He tied his horse to the post with the ease of a man accustomed to doing things himself, despite having people who could do them for him. He walked to the barn door and stopped. Miss Carter? Mr. Brooks. She wiped her hands on her work apron. This is unexpected. I should have sent word. I apologize. What brings you here? He looked at the mare's leg. What's wrong with her? Swelling. Started Monday. He came forward without asking permission. Crouched beside the leg, ran his hands along it with the sure practiced touch of a man who had done this many times. Has she been favoring it? Some. More on the hard ground. It's not broken. He stood. It may be a soft tissue strain. Keep her off the hard ground for 2 weeks and wrap it. If the swelling's not down by then, it's something else. She watched him. You came to look at my horse. No. He met her eyes. I came because I have been writing letters to a woman I've met once, and I am finding the letters insufficient. The honesty of that landed so cleanly that she didn't speak for a moment. Insufficient how? She said finally. I want to understand how you think. Letters give me pieces of it. I want the whole picture. That's a very direct thing to say. You told me you were a practical person, he said. I am being practical. I am also being honest, which I gather you prefer. She looked at him for a long moment. The barn was dim and hot, the summer pressing in from every direction, and this man was standing in her family's worn barn in his good coat, asking her to let him understand her. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Brooks? She asked. Nothing, he said. Not yet. I am proposing that we speak, as we have been speaking, but with less delay between the sentences. And if I say no, then I leave, he said simply. And I tell Alcott the lending committee should find the terms on the Hale loan permanently extended regardless. She looked at him. You'd do that either way. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I would. Then why tell me you'd do it? Because I don't want you to feel obligated, he said, and because I thought you'd want to know. She turned back to the mare and checked the leg one more time, not because it needed checking, but because she needed a moment to stand still and think. When she turned back, he was waiting exactly where she'd left him without impatience. You can stay for coffee, she said. My father will want to meet you. I would be glad to meet him. He may not be glad to meet you. I know, he said. I'm going to meet him anyway. She almost smiled. She stopped herself, but it was close. Come on then, she said, and walked toward the house. He followed her. That was how it began. Not with a grand declaration, not with a carriage and a ballroom, and a carefully engineered first impression, but with a lame horse and bad coffee and a father who sat down across from Nathaniel Brooks with his arms crossed and his jaw set and stared at him for a full 5 minutes before saying a single word. But that is a story for what came next. What mattered in that moment was this. Abigail Carter had walked into a room full of people who expected her to disappear, and she hadn't disappeared. She had stood at a window and held still while they talked, and she had turned around, and the man who had tested 30 women and found them all wanting had been standing 4 feet away, listening, and had said, Someone should apologize for that. And she had said, It isn't yours to apologize for. And he had said, I'm doing it anyway. She hadn't known what to do with that. She still didn't entirely. But she had let him into her barn and looked at her horse and drunk her bad coffee in her father's kitchen, and somewhere in the space between that first look across the Hargrove Hall and this moment, something had shifted. She didn't have a name for it yet. She was a practical woman. She needed more evidence before she named things. But she was paying attention. And for the first time in 3 years, so was he. Joseph Carter did not offer his hand when Nathaniel Brooks walked through the kitchen door. He looked at the man the way he might look at a storm moving in from the west, measuring it, calculating how much damage it intended to do, deciding whether there was still time to get the horses in. Nathaniel did not flinch under that look. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, Mr. Carter, I apologize for arriving without notice. That was discourteous. Joseph said nothing. Pa tea, Abigail said from the stove where she was putting the coffee on with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had decided the conversation was happening, whether anyone was ready for it or not. I heard him, Joseph said. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and crossed his arms. Sit. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. Nathaniel sat anyway. For a long moment, the kitchen held nothing but the sound of the coffee and the distant noise of the summer outside. and two men looking at each other across a kitchen table that had seen better decades. "You've been writing letters to my daughter," Joseph said. "Yes, sir." "About what?" "Easement disputes, lending committees. She has a precise understanding of how county systems work. I found the perspective useful." Joseph looked at him. "You found the perspective useful. And her company," Nathaniel said. "I found that I wanted more of it." The frankness of that landed in this room like a stone in still water. Joseph's jaw moved. Abigail set 2 cups on the table and sat down at the end between them, not as a mediator, but as a woman who intended to be present for whatever happened next. "You're 34 years old," Joseph said. "Yes." "You own more land than any man in this county." "Yes. And in 3 years, you haven't seen fit to marry any of the dozen women who've made it plain they'd welcome the arrangement." "No." "Why not?" Nathaniel looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Then he looked at Joseph Carter directly. "Because not one of them said a word I hadn't already expected." Joseph was quiet. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, not yet, but a loosening of the absolute set of his jaw. He looked at his daughter. She was looking at her own cup, and her face was composed the way it got when she was thinking hard and didn't want anyone to see it. "My daughter has a farm to save," Joseph said. "She has $73 of debt coming due in 3 weeks. She doesn't have time for a man who's going to decide she's interesting and then move on when someone more suitable comes along." "Pa," Abigail started. "No." Joseph kept his eyes on Nathaniel. "I want to hear what he says." Nathaniel set his hat on the table. "I spoke to Alcott 2 weeks ago about the lending committee. The terms on the Hale loan are being renegotiated. Whatever happens between your daughter and me, that stands. I want you to know that first." Joseph's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because I don't want her sitting across from me wondering if she has to be agreeable to keep the farm. I want to know what she actually thinks of me, and that can't happen if she's afraid of the answer." The kitchen went very quiet. Joseph looked at his daughter. Abigail was looking at Nathaniel now, and whatever she'd kept out of her face before was slightly less controlled. Not much, but enough. "You've got nerve," Joseph said finally. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't an insult. It was just the truth. "I've been told that," Nathaniel said. Joseph picked up his cup. "Drink your coffee. Then you can tell me what you actually want with my daughter." It was not a welcome, but it was not a door shut either. And in the Carter kitchen, in the heavy heat of August 1817, that was enough to begin. Nathaniel drank his coffee, and then he told the truth, which was that he didn't entirely know what he wanted, yet only that he'd written 14 letters to a woman he'd met once and found them insufficient, and that he'd rather spend 2 hours in an honest conversation than 2 years in a comfortable arrangement with someone who told him only what he wanted to hear. Joseph listened. His arms stayed crossed for the first half. By the end, they were resting on the table. I didn't say he approved. He didn't say he didn't. He stood when Nathaniel stood and shook the man's hand at the door. Brief, firm, the handshake of a man reserving judgment, and watched him ride back down the road without a word. Then he went inside and stood in the kitchen and looked at his daughter. "Well," he said. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were going to say I should be careful." "You should be careful," Joseph said. "That is a man with a great deal to offer and a very specific idea of what he wants in return. Those men are the ones who are hardest to say no to when the time comes." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. "I'm always careful, Pa." "I know," he said. "I know you are." He sat back down in his chair. "That doesn't stop me worrying." She squeezed his shoulder once as she passed him and went outside because the east field still needed checking and there was work to do, and because she needed the open air and the familiar weight of the farm under her feet to keep herself on solid ground. She was always careful. That was true. But she thought about what he'd said. "I want to know what she actually thinks of me," and she thought about the fact that he'd fixed the loan before he'd come, without telling her, without holding it over her head, without making her ask. She had spent most of her life around men who held things over people's heads. She knew what that looked like. This was not that. What it was, she wasn't sure yet. but she was paying attention. The east field was dry, and the peach trees needed water, and she stood at the edge of her father's land and breathed in the summer and told herself she was still on solid ground. She almost believed it. The second time Nathaniel came, he sent word ahead. A short note delivered by the same gray mare boy. Would Thursday morning be convenient? I would like to see the eastern timber parcels you mentioned. NB. She wrote back. Thursday is fine. Come before the heat. He came at 7 in the morning before the heat. And he came in work clothes, not his good coat, not the polished boots. He wore a plain shirt and worn trousers and boots that had seen actual mud, and when he tied his horse at the gate and walked across the yard, he looked like a man who intended to work, not a man who had come to inspect. She noticed that. She filed it away. They walked the eastern parcel together. She showed him the oak stands, the property line markers, the creek that ran along the southern edge and slowed to almost nothing in August. She talked about the timber rights she'd been offered and why she hadn't taken them the price she'd been given and what she thought the timber was actually worth. He asked questions, good ones. Not the kind designed to seem interested, but the kind that built on her answers, that showed he'd heard her and was thinking it through. At one point he said, "You could hold out for a better buyer. Someone from the eastern counties who doesn't know the local market. You'd get closer to your actual number." "I'd get closer to my number in November," she said. "The loan is due September 1st. He was quiet for a moment. "Right. Time matters differently when you don't have enough of it," she said, not harshly, just factually. A good price in 3 months is the same as no price when the deadline's in 3 weeks. He looked at her. "I know that. I was thinking out loud without accounting for your actual situation." That was careless. She hadn't expected the correction. Most men didn't do that, didn't stop mid-thought and admit they'd gotten something wrong. She'd noticed it, and she didn't know what to do with it, so she moved on. "The timber's not going to solve it anyway," she said. "Even at the right price, I've run the numbers. It gets me to 50, maybe 55, not 73. He said nothing. He walked beside her and said nothing, and she understood that he was not trying to fix it this time. He was just listening. He had learned somewhere between Tuesday and Thursday that there was a difference. She almost told him that was more useful than any amount of money. She didn't, because she was careful, but she thought it. They walked back in the late morning heat, and she poured him water from the well, and they stood in the yard and she said, "You went to a lot of trouble to come look at timber. You have no interest in buying." "I have some interest in buying it," he said. "At what price?" "Whatever you think it's worth." She looked at him. "That's not how timber is bought. It is if the buyer has other interests in the transaction," he said, and the simplicity of it, not romantic, not coy, just plain sat between them in the hot morning air. "Mr. Brooks," she said carefully, "I need you to understand something." "All right. I am not a woman who can be bought into a favorable disposition. I know that. And I am not a woman who will mistake a financial kindness for something it isn't. I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not trying to buy anything, Miss Carter. I'm telling you that the timber is worth what you say it is, and I can pay it without negotiating, and that would solve one of your problems. What I am not doing is attaching any condition to that. There is no condition. People always have conditions." "Yes," he said. "They do. I am telling you I don't, and I understand perfectly well that you have no reason to believe me, and I am suggesting that the only way you'll know whether it's true is to let me prove it over time, which I cannot do in a single conversation." She stood with that for a moment. The yard was quiet. The mare moved in the barn. Her father was somewhere in the house, probably listening through the window. "How much time?" she asked. "However much you'll give me," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll think about the timber." "That's all I asked," he said. He left at noon before her father came out to find reasons to disapprove of him, and Abigail stood at the gate after the sound of his horse faded and pressed her hand flat against the post and held onto the solid wood like she was checking whether it was still there. It was still there. That was good. She needed things that stayed where she left them. She went inside and told her father she was selling the timber to Nathaniel Brooks. Joseph looked at her for a long moment. At what price? Mine, she said. He nodded once, said nothing more, went back to his boots. She sat down at this kitchen table and opened the ledger and moved the numbers. $58 from the timber at her price, $12 from the savings under the floorboard, 3 more she could make from sewing before September. That brought her to 73. Exactly 73. She sat looking at that number for a long time. Then she closed the ledger and went to start supper. She was careful. She was always careful. But she was beginning to understand that careful did not mean closed, that you could hold your ground and still let someone walk beside you, that those were not the same thing. She was still working out what came after understanding that. The letters continued. They were different now, not about county business, not about easements, or rather, they were about those things, but around the edges there was something else. He wrote about his father once briefly about the estate, and what he'd found when he took it on, and what it had cost him. He didn't ask for sympathy. He wrote about it the way Abigail wrote about difficult things, like a fact that needed acknowledging before you could move past it. She wrote back about her mother. The peach trees. The year she was 16, and her father couldn't get out of bed for 6 weeks, and she'd run the farm herself, learned the accounts, made the decisions. She didn't write it as a complaint. She wrote it as what it was, something she'd done that had made her into the person she was now, that she didn't regret, even though it had been hard. He wrote, "You have been carrying things most people would have put down. I think you don't always know how heavy they are because you've been carrying them so long." She read that and set the letter down and walked outside and stood at the edge of the yard for 10 minutes because she was not going to cry over a letter from a man she had known for 5 weeks, and she was going to need a moment to enforce that decision. She won. Barely. She wrote back, "I think you've been alone so long, you've started to mistake solitude for preference. They're not the same thing." His reply came the following day, faster than usual. 1 sentence, I know. 2 letters. 4 words between 2 people, and somehow the entire architecture of what they were to each other shifted. She felt it. She suspected he did too. The 1st of September arrived, and Edmund Hale received full payment on the Carter loan, the timber money, the savings, the sewing income, all of it accounted for to the last dollar, and signed the release without a word, because the men on the lending committee had made it quietly clear that his practices in the southern parcels had attracted attention, and he would do well not to make any additional noise. Abigail didn't know all of that. She knew the payment was accepted. She knew the farm was safe. She stood in the yard in the early September morning and breathed in air that felt different, lighter, or she was lighter. One of the two, and let herself have 20 seconds of pure, uncomplicated relief before the next thing. The next thing arrived 3 days later in the form of Charlotte Hale, Edmund's niece. 20 years old, dark-haired, dressed in clothes that cost more than Abigail made in a year, and possessed of the kind of self-assurance that came from never once having had to ask whether there was enough money for something. She arrived at Hargrove Hall's autumn gathering, smaller than the summer one, but still the social event of the season. And within 30 minutes of her arrival, it was clear to every woman in the room that she had not come for the gathering. She had come for Nathaniel Brooks. Abigail saw it from across the room. She was standing with Martha Whitfield, half listening to a story about the Whitfields' new fence, and she watched Charlotte Hale cross the room toward Nathaniel with the focused intent of a woman who had been told what she was there to do and intended to do it thoroughly. She watched Nathaniel turn as Charlotte approached. She watched the polite arrangement of his face, that careful composure, and she watched Charlotte say something that made the women around her laugh. She looked away. "You all right?" Martha said. "Fine," Abigail said. "I'm fine." She was fine. She was absolutely fine. She had no claim on Nathaniel Brooks. They had exchanged letters and walked a timber parcel and drunk bad coffee in her father's kitchen. That was not a claim. That was correspondence. Conversation. Whatever it was not a claim. She moved to the edge of the room and told herself this clearly and firmly, and believed most of it. She did not look back across the room for 11 minutes, which she counted. When she did look, Nathaniel was watching her. Not Charlotte, who was still talking. Not the room in general. Nathaniel Brooks was looking directly at Abigail Carter from across the Hargrove Hall. autumn gathering with the specific, steady attention of a man who had known exactly where she was for the past 11 minutes. She looked at him. He didn't look away. Charlotte said something. He turned back to her because courtesy required it, but it cost him something. She could see that from across the room, the slight tension in his jaw, the way he answered without any of the engagement he gave to things that mattered to him. Martha Whitfield said, "You know he's been asking about you." "Who has?" Abigail said, though she knew. "Don't do that," Martha said, not unkindly. "You're not a woman who plays games." "I'm not playing anything." "I know, that's why I'm telling you. Charlotte Hale's father and Edmund Hale are brothers. If she marries Brooks, that lending committee problem goes away for the Hale family entirely." Martha's voice went quiet. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know what's happening in that corner of the room." Abigail stood with that information and let it settle into its proper shape. Strategy. Charlotte was strategy, which meant someone, Edmund or Charlotte's father or both, had identified a problem and sent a solution in a pretty dress. She looked across the room again. Nathaniel's eyes had come back to her. She saw the moment he registered that she understood something in his expression shifted very slightly, like a door opening a crack. She gave him nothing back. Held her face still. Looked away first. She was careful. She was always careful. She was also for the first time in a long time afraid. Not of losing the farm. That fear, she knew it had a shape and a weight, and she had learned to carry it. This was different. This was the particular fear of having let something matter before you knew whether it was going to stay. She had let it matter. She hadn't meant to, or she had meant to, and hadn't admitted it, and now it was too late to unmatter it, and Charlotte Hale was across the room in an expensive dress, and Abigail Carter was standing at the edge of everything in her faded blue cotton and her mother's pearl earrings, and she was not going to do a single thing about it. She would not chase him. She would not compete. She had not spent 24 years building herself into a woman with a spine just to perform jealousy at a social gathering. She finished her glass of lemonade and set it down and went to say goodbye to Ruth Alcott because she was going home. Nathaniel found her at the door. I didn't make a scene of it. He simply materialized beside her as she was collecting her shawl from the hallway table, quiet as a man who moved through rooms without announcing himself. "You're leaving," he said. "It's a long drive home," she said. "It's 8 o'clock. The road is worse in the dark." She picked up her shawl. She did not look at him. "Abigail." It was the first time he had used her given name. It landed differently than she'd expected. Not familiar, not presumptuous, just right in the way that some things are simply right, and you can't argue them out of being. She looked at him. "Charlotte Hale is a strategy," he said. "I need you to know I understand that. What you know or don't know about Charlotte Hale has nothing to do with me," she said evenly. "I disagree." "Mr. Brooks." "Nathaniel," he said. "We have written each other nearly 20 letters. I think you can manage my given name." She looked at him for a long moment. The hallway was dim, the noise of the gathering a warm blur behind them, and he was standing close enough that she could see the steady hold of his jaw, the controlled quiet of a man who was being very careful about what he said next. "What do you want to tell me?" she said. "That I sent her back to the gathering," he said. "That I have no interest in what her family is trying to accomplish. That I have been standing in that room for the last hour, thinking about whether I am handling this correctly, and concluding that I am probably not, but I know with absolute certainty that letting you leave without saying this would be worse." He paused. "I am not good at this. I want you to know that. I have spent 3 years being good at being alone, which is a much simpler skill set." Something loosened in her chest, not all the way, but enough to breathe differently. "You are doing better than you think," she said quietly. "Am I?" "You used my name," she said. "That was the right instinct." He looked at her. Not the measuring look, not the careful, composed look. Something more unguarded than either. "Stay," he said. "There's still an hour. Stay." She looked at him for a long moment. Thought about careful. Thought about the farm being safe, her father's handshake at the door. The letters in the kitchen drawer. 4 words. I know that had shifted something she hadn't finished understanding yet. She put her shawl back on the table. 1 hour, she said. He looked at her like she'd handed him something he'd been reaching for a very long time. 1 hour, he agreed. And they walked back into the gathering side by side, not touching, not announcing anything to the room, but together in the way that needed no announcement, the way of two people who had decided quietly and without ceremony to stop being alone. The county noticed. Of course it did. You couldn't stand beside Nathaniel Brooks in a room full of people who'd been watching him for 3 years without the county noticing. Abigail felt the attention like a change in weather, the slight shift of eyes, the adjusted conversations, the particular quality of silence that settled around two people when everyone around them has realized something at the same moment. She held her chin up and kept her shoulders back and said nothing because there was nothing to say yet and because the work of being seen without apologizing for it was something she had practice in. Nathaniel stood beside her and spoke to Reverend Moss and Thomas Hargrove and said nothing about what had happened in the hallway and offered no explanation for the shift in his orbit because he was a man who did not explain himself to rooms only to the people who mattered. Charlotte Hale left early. Abigail saw her go from across the room, the straight back, the careful carriage, the absence of any expression that would betray what she was thinking. She felt something that was not quite guilt and not quite victory, and resolved not to spend much time on either one. At 9 o'clock, when the 1 hour had passed, Nathaniel walked her to the door himself. He helped her with her shawl, careful, unhurried, not taking any more than what the gesture required. "Thursday," he said. "What about Thursday?" she said. "Let me come for supper. Let me meet your father properly." "You've met my father." "I met him for 20 minutes over bad coffee," he said. "I want to meet him properly. Let me make my intentions clear to him." She looked at him. "What are your intentions?" He held her gaze. "To be worth trusting," he said. "That's where I want to start. Everything else follows from that." She stood with that for a moment. The night air was warm, and the sounds of the gathering drifted out from the hall behind them, and the road home was dark and long. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he agreed. She walked to the wagon. She did not look back. But she was smiling when she picked up the reins, and she kept it to herself because it was hers, and she wasn't ready to share it with the night yet. Behind her. Inside the hall, she heard Charlotte Hale's father, a man named Robert, thick-shouldered and loud, say something to the man beside him that ended with the words, "Carter girl," and a sound that wasn't quite laughter. She did not stop. She did not turn around. But her hands tightened on the reins, and the thing that had been loosening in her chest tightened again, and she thought with the particular clarity that comes to people who have been dismissed their entire lives and have learned to hear it coming from 3 rooms away, that the peace she was beginning to allow herself was going to cost something before it was finished. She just didn't know yet what. Thursday came, and with it, a supper that Abigail cooked herself. Nothing elaborate. She didn't have the means for elaborate. She made what the farm gave them, and she made it well. And Nathaniel Brooks sat across the table from Joseph Carter, and this time Joseph's arms were not crossed. He still wasn't warm. He was not a warm man by temperament, and he had not become one. But he asked Nathaniel questions, real ones, not performances about the land, about the lending committee, about what he'd thought when his father died and left him everything, and how he'd decided what to do with it. And Nathaniel answered him directly, with the same plainness he used with Abigail. And something about the evening shifted the way it had in the kitchen that first morning only further. After supper, Joseph went to sit on the porch. He said it was for the air. Abigail suspected it was to give them 20 minutes and maintain plausible ignorance. She and Nathaniel sat at the kitchen table with the remnants of supper between them and the lamp lit against the evening. "He's deciding whether to trust me," Nathaniel said. "He's been deciding since the first morning," she said. "What will help him decide?" She considered. "Time," she said. "Consistency. He's had enough people be nice once and then stop." Nathaniel nodded. Then he said carefully, "I heard what Robert Hale said at the gathering, at the door as you were leaving." She looked at her cup. "Did you?" "I should have said something. I didn't, and I've been thinking about that since." "It wasn't your place to say something on my behalf." "Maybe not," he said. "But it sits wrong with me." "You'll have to learn to let it sit wrong," she said. "People will say things. They've been saying things about my family for 2 years. I can't stop them, and neither can you, and if I stopped every time someone said something, I'd never get anywhere." He looked at her. "You shouldn't have to." "No," she agreed. "I shouldn't. But I do. That's the difference between how things should be and how they are, and I've made my peace with it." "I haven't," he said quietly. She looked at him across the lamplit table and saw something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not the kind that wanted a fight. The kind that sat deep and still, that had been sitting there for a long time, and had finally found a target. The kind that belonged to a man who had watched his own power used against people he cared about, and had not forgiven himself for it. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked at her. "I am not something that needs defending," she said. "I am something that needs respecting. There's a difference. Defending puts you between me and the world. Respecting puts us side by side. I need the second one. The first one I have managed without for 24 years, and I don't need to start depending on it now." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's the clearest thing anyone has ever said to me about what they need." "I'm a practical person," she said. "You are," he said, and then quietly, "I'm trying to be better at it." Outside on the porch, her father's chair creaked. The summer insects were loud. The lamp flickered once and steadied. "I know you are," she said. She was still careful. She would always be careful. It was in her bones. But something was building between them that was bigger than careful, and she could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives in the change of pressure in the particular quality of the air. She didn't name it yet. She was a practical woman. She needed more evidence. But she was no longer pretending she didn't feel it. And neither from the look on his face across the table was he. The trouble arrived as trouble often does, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet knock on the wrong door at the wrong time. It was a Tuesday in late September, 2 weeks after the supper that had changed the shape of the evenings in the Carter kitchen. Nathaniel had come twice more since then, once with a question about the eastern parcel that was probably not entirely about the eastern parcel, and once with no pretext at all, which Abigail had noted and said nothing about. Her father had started leaving the lamp lit on the porch when he went to bed early, which was its own kind of statement. She was coming back from Ruth Alcott's when she saw the horse at the gate. Not Nathaniel's black. A bay she didn't recognize, well-fed and expensive, tied with the confident looseness of a man who expected someone to mind it for him. She slowed her own mare and looked at the horse and then at the house, and something tightened at the base of her throat. She went in. Robert Hale was sitting at her kitchen table. He had not been invited in. She could see from her father's face the specific white compression of his jaw that this had not been a welcome entry. Robert Hale was a large man, thick through the shoulders, with the settled ease of someone who had been making himself comfortable in other people's spaces his entire life and had never once been told to stop. "Miss Carter," he said, as though he were doing her a favor by remembering her name. "I was just telling your father I had a business proposition." Abigail set her basket on the counter. She did not sit down. "I wasn't aware we had any business, Mr. Hale." "We don't yet," he said pleasantly. "That's what I'm here about." She looked at her father. Eyes that said, "I did not ask him to stay, and I do not know how to remove him without a scene." She pulled out a chair and sat across from Robert Hale and folded her hands on the table and waited. "I'll be plain," he said. "I appreciate plain." "So do I," she said. "You're an intelligent woman, Miss Carter. You've managed this farm through hard years. That's admirable. My nephew Edmund, he respects that. In fact, he's come to think rather highly of your family." "Your nephew sent a foreclosure notice," she said. "In April, without warning. Business," Hale said, waving one hand. "Nothing personal. Edmund operates by the numbers, but he's reconsidered. He'd like to extend an offer." He paused, and the pause was designed, she could see that, designed to make the next words feel like a gift. "My nephew is prepared to forgive the remainder of any outstanding interest on that loan. Clear record. In exchange for a formal understanding." "What kind of understanding?" she said. "He'd like to call on you," Hale said. "Formally, with the intent of marriage." The kitchen was very quiet. Her father made a sound that was not quite a word. Edmund is 41, Abigail said. He has buried one wife. A widower, Hale said. Established. Comfortable. He could offer you security, Miss Carter. Real security. Not... He paused again, and this pause was different, sharper. Not the temporary attention of a man who has a habit of losing interest. She looked at him. Are we talking about a specific man? I'm talking about your situation, he said. Which I understand better than you might think. She understood then. This was not about Edmund's affections. Edmund Hale had never spoken 6 words to her in her life, and had no more interest in her as a person than he had in any other piece of property he might acquire. This was about Nathaniel. About whatever Robert Hale had told his brother's family in the aftermath of the autumn gathering. About the lending committee and the intervention, and a man who had moved quietly on her behalf and made enemies he hadn't fully accounted for. This was a counter-move. Mr. Hale, she said very carefully, I appreciate you coming. The answer is no. His expression didn't change. You should think about it. I have thought about it. The time between your saying it and my answering it was sufficient. The answer is no. Miss Carter. This is my father's house, she said. You came in without an invitation. I'm inviting you to leave now. Something moved across his face. Not anger exactly. Not yet. More like a recalibration. The adjustment a man makes when he realizes the conversation isn't going the way he planned and decides to change his approach. He stood. He picked up his hat from the table. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has not yet decided what he's going to do, but has definitely decided something. You're making a mistake, he said. I make my own mistakes, she said. That's something I've always been particular about. He left. She heard the horse go. Her father sat at the table and pressed both hands flat against the wood. Abigail. I know. That man doesn't hear no and move on. I know that too. What are you going to do? She sat for a moment. The kitchen felt different with Hale gone from it, cleaner, but also colder, like a window had been opened. I'm going to tell Nathaniel, she said. Her father looked up. Why? Because he moved on our behalf, and he has a right to know what it's cost, she said. And because, she stopped. Because, her father said quietly. She looked at him. Because I'm tired of carrying things alone, she said. Just this once. Joseph Carter looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he nodded once and said nothing more, and that silence was the most complete approval he had ever given her. She wrote to Nathaniel that evening. Not one of their usual letters, not about county matters or practical things. Short, direct. The way she wrote when something was real. Robert Hale came to the house today on behalf of Edmund. A formal proposal with conditions attached. I declined. I thought you should know, as I believe the visit was connected to your actions on the lending committee. There may be consequences I haven't foreseen. I wanted you to have the information. AC. How was at the gate before noon the next day? She was in the barn with the mare when she heard him, and she came out still holding the grooming brush, and he came across the yard with a quickness in his step that she had not seen from him before. He was not a man who moved urgently. He moved deliberately. That urgency meant something. Tell me exactly what he said, he said, stopping in front of her. She told him. All of it in the order it happened without editorializing. She was good at giving a clean account of a thing without the extra weight of how it had made her feel. She had learned early that the facts were more useful than the feelings, and that the feelings could be sorted out separately later. He listened, his jaw set tighter with each sentence. He implied I was temporary, she said last. That was the word he used. Temporary attention. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then, I should have anticipated this. How could you have? Because I know Robert Hale, he said. I know how that family operates. When I went to the lending committee, I knew there would be a response. I didn't think... He stopped. Something crossed his face that she hadn't seen there before. I didn't think they'd go directly to you. That was careless of me. I put you in the middle of something without fully accounting for the consequences. She looked at him. You were trying to help. I know. And I did it without asking you first, without understanding." He stopped again, and she could see him working through something the way he did when he was being honest about an unpleasant truth. "Without understanding that helping you without asking first is still a form of deciding things for you. I thought I was solving a problem. I was actually just being another man who moved pieces around without telling you what game was being played." She held the grooming brush in both hands and looked at him. "That's the most self-aware thing I've ever heard anyone say," she said. "I mean it," he said. "I know you do. That's why I said it." She set the brush against the barn door. "You're right. You should have told me. But Robert Hale was going to be a problem eventually, regardless of what you did. Men like that don't need a specific reason. They need an opportunity. You didn't create the problem. You just accelerated the timeline. That doesn't make me feel better about it." "It's not supposed to make you feel better," she said. "It's supposed to help you think clearly. You can feel bad and think clearly at the same time, but you have to do both." He looked at her with an expression she was coming to recognize, the one that appeared when she said something that landed differently than he expected. Like she'd shown him a door in a wall he'd thought was solid. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "About Hale. About all of it. I want to know what you want, Abigail. Not what I think should happen. What you want." She took a breath. It was a simple question, and it shouldn't have felt as weighty as it did, except that in her experience, people rarely asked it. They told her what was sensible, or what was proper, or what the options were, as though her job was to select from a list they'd already composed. "I want to keep the farm," she said. "I want my father to not spend the rest of his years afraid of losing it. I want Robert Hale to not be able to use our vulnerability as leverage." She paused. "And I want—" She stopped. "Tell me," he said. "I want what's been building between us to not become a casualty of someone else's strategy," she said. "I don't want to be careful to the point of losing something real because I was too afraid to say it was real." The yard was quiet around them. The September light was changing softer, lower, the first suggestion of autumn, at the edges of the heat. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, and then said in a voice that was careful in a different way than hers. "Careful. The way a man is careful with something he is afraid to damage. I don't want that either." "Then we agree," she said. "We agree," he said, and that was that, in the plain and unceremonious way of two practical people who had decided something. No grand declaration, no theater, just an agreement between two people who had stopped pretending they weren't in one. What neither of them said, because neither of them had to, was that the agreement also meant the next step was no longer private. Robert Hale had made it public. He had come to her door with a counteroffer, and she had declined, and that meant the county would know before the week was out. In a place where everyone watched everyone else and had done for generations, privacy was a thing you maintained until the moment it wasn't, and after that you made peace with being seen. Abigail had been seen her whole life. Not kindly mostly, but she knew how to stand in it. What she hadn't done before was stand in it with someone beside her. She was still learning what that felt like. The county did not wait for an invitation to have opinions. By Friday, the news had made the full circuit from the Alcott house to the Whitfield farm to the tavern at the north end of town, and back again with considerable embellishment at each stop. The version Abigail heard third hand through Martha Whitfield was that she had turned down Edmund Hale's proposal in front of witnesses and laughed while doing it, which was not accurate, but was considerably more dramatic and therefore preferred. "You didn't laugh," Martha said with the slight disappointment of someone who had been hoping for the dramatic version. "I did not laugh," Abigail said. "That's a shame," Martha said. "The other version is better." What came next was not as easy to laugh at. It was a Saturday morning, and Abigail was at the dry goods store picking up thread and flour, the small necessary commerce of a life, when she heard Robert Hale's voice, carrying from the front of the store. How was talking to two men she recognized: Beaumont, who owned the mill, and Graves, who sat on the county council. He was not speaking quietly. "A girl who doesn't know her circumstances," he was saying. "It's a pity. Her father's land is good land. It'll be good land when someone with proper means owns it." Beaumont said something she didn't catch. "Oh, Brooks will move on," Hale said. "He always does. And when he does, she'll find the market considerably less favorable. That's all I'm saying." She stood at the back of the store with her thread in her hand and breathed slowly. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would not let men like Robert Hale see her flinch. It was a promise she had kept. She walked to the front of the store. She set her items on the counter. She said good morning to Mr. Hendricks behind the counter and gave him her order clearly and waited while he filled it. Robert Hale watched her the entire time. She did not look at him. She paid. She picked up her package. She turned to go. "Miss Carter," Hale said. She stopped. She turned around. Howe was smiling. The smile that arrived slightly after it should on the slow hinge. "I hope you'll reconsider," he said. "Edmund's offer stands, for now." "For now," she repeated. "Things change," he said pleasantly. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. The store was quiet around them. Beaumont and Graves were watching with the careful attention of men who wanted to see what happened next. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I want to be clear with you since you've said you appreciate Plain. I will not reconsider Edmund's offer. Not now, not in a month, not if circumstances change. I understand you believe you have leverage over my situation. I'm telling you that leverage operates differently on people who are accustomed to having nothing. When you've already lost most of what you had, the threat of losing more stops working." She let that sit for a moment. "Good morning," she said, and walked out. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached the wagon. She pressed them flat against her thighs and held them there until they stopped, because she was not going to let Robert Hale see her hands shake, not even from a distance, not even when she was alone. She had meant what she said. She had also been more afraid saying it than anything she'd let show. She drove home. She didn't tell her father. She told the mayor, which was a practice she had maintained since childhood and found reliable. The mayor's opinion on Robert Hale was delivered in the form of disinterested ear movement, which Abigail found comforting. That evening, there was a letter. Not from Nathaniel. From Judge Alcott. Formal, carefully worded the way Alcott wrote when he was telling you something that needed to be on record. She read it twice. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and read it again. Edmund Hale had filed a claim with the county council. Not a foreclosure, the loan was paid, that door was shut. Something else. He was claiming that the timber sale, the one Abigail had made to Nathaniel in August, had been conducted under fraudulent misrepresentation of the land's value. He was claiming she had inflated the timber's worth to secure a deal from a buyer who was not operating in full commercial good faith. The claim was thin. She could see that immediately. She knew the timber's value. She had priced it carefully. She had the ledger records and the comparable sales from 2 neighboring properties to prove it. This was not a claim built to win. This was a claim built to create noise, to drag the transaction into question, to force Nathaniel to defend his judgment publicly, to make Abigail's name a subject of county council discussion in a way that carried its own kind of damage, regardless of outcome. She set the letter down. Her father came in from the porch. "What's that?" he said. She handed it to him. He read it. She watched his face go through the same sequence hers had: comprehension, then anger, then the particular cold resolution of a man who had been backed into corners before and knew the only thing to do was find the weak point in the wall. "This is Hale," he said. "Yes. He couldn't get what he wanted through the front door, so he's going around." "Yes. What do you need?" her father said. She looked at him. In her entire life, she could count on one hand the times her father had asked her that question and waited for a real answer. He was asking it now. "I need to tell Nathaniel tonight," she said. "And I need to find Alcott's wife in the morning." "Ruth will know what documents to pull," her father said. "Yes." "All right." He set the letter on the table. "Then that's what we do." She rode to Nathaniel's estate that evening for the first time. She had never been, and she noted the distance and the road and the way the property sat on the ridge, not with the admiration she might have felt in a different mood, but with the practical attention she gave to geography that mattered. She would need to know this road. He came out before she reached the door. He had heard the horse, or he had been watching. She suspected the latter because he was the kind of man whose attention had a quality of readiness to it. He took one look at her face and said, "Come inside." She sat in his study spare organized a room that looked like its owner and told him about the claim. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet she had come to understand was him thinking, rather than him disappearing. "This is my fault," he said. "Stop," she said. "Abigail." "I said stop." She looked at him directly. "If you spend the next hour telling me what you should have done differently, we will waste the only time we have to think about what to do now. You can feel guilty tomorrow. Tonight we need to think." He looked at her. Then something in him reset. She could see it, the shift from self-recrimination to focus, and he said, "All right, what do you have?" "The original timber assessment, the ledger. 2 comparable sales from neighboring properties in the last 18 months. Alcott will know where the claim is weakest." "The claim is baseless," he said. "Baseless claims still require answers," she said. "And answers take time and standing and access to people with authority. I have some of those things. You have more. I'll go to Alcott in the morning." "I'm going too," she said. He looked at her. "Of course," he said. No argument. No suggestion that she let him handle it. Just of course. She had not realized how much she had been braced for resistance until it didn't come. They sat in his study for 2 hours and went through every document. He had records, she didn't, the correspondence from the lending committee, the original notes from when he'd approached Alcott. She had records, he didn't, the farm ledger, the timber assessment, the receipts from the payment to Edmund Hale. Together the picture was clear, clean. The claim had no legs, but they both knew that wasn't entirely the point. "Even if we win at the council," she said, "Hale will have gotten what he wanted. My name attached to a dispute, your judgment questioned, the county talking." "Let them talk," Nathaniel said. "It's easy to say that when the talking doesn't follow you into every store and every gathering for the rest of your life in this county," she said. Not harshly, just true. How was quiet. She watched him take that in. Really take it in, not dismiss it or argue it, but sit with the fact that things landed differently on her than on him, and that this was not a hypothetical. "You're right," he said. "I don't carry it the same way." "No," she said. "You don't. Tell me what you need from me." She looked at him. "I need you to stand behind the transaction publicly. Not explain it. Not apologize for it. Stand behind it. The minute you start qualifying or softening, you hand them something to use." "I have no intention of qualifying anything," he said. "I know. I needed to say it." "I know," he said. "You needed to hear yourself say it too." She looked at him across the study. He was right about that, and she hadn't entirely realized it until he said it. "We're going to be all right," he said, quietly, steady. "I know," she said. And she did know. The documents were solid. Alcott was fair. The claim was thin. But what she didn't know, what was waiting just past the edge of the firelight in that room, was that Robert Hale had not filed the claim himself. He had persuaded someone else to file it. Someone whose name on a council document carried more weight than Hale's. Someone Abigail had considered an ally. She found out the next morning, sitting across the table from Judge Alcott, when he slid the document across to her, and she read the signature at the bottom. Thomas Hargrove. The man whose hall she had walked into on that summer evening. Whose gathering she had attended. Who had smiled at her and called her by her first name, and whose wife had always been kind. She sat very still and read the name again. "When?" she said. "Filed Thursday," Alcott said. "Why?" Alcott looked at her with the careful expression of a man who knew more than he was about to say. "The Hargrove family has significant business interests connected to the Hale money-lending operation," he said. "I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions." She drew them. They were not difficult to draw. The web was wider than she'd understood. Hale's reach went further. And Thomas Hargrove, who had opened his hall to the county's social gatherings and let the summer light in through the tall windows, and seemed like a man of decent instincts, had signed his name to a fraudulent claim against her because it cost him less than refusing. Nathaniel, sitting beside her, had gone very still. "Hargrove," he said. The word came out flat and final. Yes, Alcott said. Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to Abigail, and his face, that composed, controlled, always measuring face, had cracked open in a way she had not seen before. Not with rage, with something worse. With the specific grief of a man who has just discovered that someone he thought he understood had chosen the smaller thing. I have known Thomas Hargrove for 15 years, he said. I know, she said. He sat at my father's table. I know. She put her hand over his on the table. Not a gesture she had made before. Not something she had planned. She just did it because it was what the moment required. We'll answer the claim. We'll answer it cleanly, and it won't stand. That is what matters right now. He looked at her hand on his. Then he looked at her. You are the steadiest person I have ever known, he said. I'm not steady, she said. I'm controlled. There's a difference. I'm holding a great deal of things very tightly right now. I know, he said. And the way he said it, like he actually knew, like he had been paying close enough attention to see through the control to what was underneath, broke something open in her, the way the Hargrove signature had broken something open in him. We are going to be all right, she said. She said it back to him. His words returned. I know, he said. Alcott cleared his throat. If I could direct your attention to the counterfiling documents. They both straightened. They let go at the same time, turned back to the papers on the table. But something had crossed between them in that moment that could not be uncrossed. Some last remaining careful distance between them had closed, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but with the simple, irreversible completeness of something that was done. The council hearing was set for the 3rd week of October. They had 21 days. And Robert Hale Abigail was beginning to understand was only the most visible part of something larger, a network of interest and investment that had been operating in the shadows of the county's polite gatherings for years, using the lending committee and the council and the comfortable social ties between powerful men to move money and land in ways that looked from a distance like ordinary commerce. She had walked into the middle of it without knowing it was there. And now, with Nathaniel beside her and 21 days on the clock, and her father's farm, and her name, and everything she had spent her life building sitting in the balance, she was going to have to walk straight through it. She was afraid. She was not going to pretend otherwise, at least not to herself. But she picked up the counterfiling documents, and she read every word, and she started to work. Because she was Abigail Carter. She had been carrying hard things since she was 16 years old. And she had never once put them down. The 21 days before the council hearing did not pass slowly. They moved the way hard time always moves, in a strange combination of too fast and too long. The hours compressed during the work and stretched during the nights when the work was done, and there was nothing left to do but lie still and think. Abigail did not sleep well. She had never been a woman who slept well when something was unresolved, and what was unresolved now was not a small thing. She lay in the dark and ran the documents through her mind, the way she ran the farm ledger line by line, looking for gaps, looking for weaknesses, looking for anything Hale's people might use that she hadn't already accounted for. She always found the same answer. The claim was thin. The evidence was clean. On paper, they should win. But she had lived long enough in Shenandoah County to know that paper and reality were different countries, and the distance between them was traveled entirely by the people with the most influence over which version got told. Nathaniel came every other day. Not to press, not to manage. She had made clear she didn't need managing, and he had heard her the first time, which remained one of the most significant things about him. He came to work. He sat at the kitchen table with his documents, and she sat with hers, and they built the counterfiling together the way you build something meant to last, carefully, with attention to every joint. Her father made coffee and stayed out of the way, which was his particular form of support, and which she appreciated more than she could have said. On the 5th day, Nathaniel looked up from a document and said, "There are 3 other families." She looked up. "What?" "3 other families in the county with loans through the Hale operation. I've been looking at the lending committee records. Alcott let me review the file indexes. The terms on 2 of those loans have the same structure as yours did before the renegotiation. Variable repayment triggers tied to land value assessments that Hale controls." He set the paper down. "He can move the assessment. Inflate the trigger. Call the loan early whenever he chooses. She stared at him. He's done it before. I think so. I think the Marsh family's sale last spring, the one everyone said was voluntary, I think it wasn't voluntary. The Marsh farm. 50 acres on the South Creek. 3 generations. Gone in a single spring, and the Marsh family relocated to Richmond before anyone thought to ask questions which she understood now was probably not an accident. How many people know this? She said. Right now, you and me and Alcott, who I think has suspected for some time, but didn't have the thread to pull. She looked at him. This changes the scope of what we're doing. Yes, he said. We're not just defending a timber transaction anymore. No, he said. We're not. She was quiet for a moment. This was the moment she recognized it the way you recognize a fork in a road where the careful, practical choice was to stay small. Defend the claim. Win the specific fight. Keep her head down. Not every battle needed to be larger than the one in front of you. She knew that. She had lived by it for years. Who are the 3 families? She said. He told her. She knew 2 of them, the Hendersons from the North End, and the Prewitt family, who had 5 children and a dairy operation, and who could not afford any version of what had happened to the Marsh family. She picked up her pen. Then we need to talk to them. Nathaniel looked at her across the table. He had that expression again, the one she had started to think of as the door-in-a-wall look. Do you understand what you're taking on? I understand exactly what I'm taking on, she said. The question is whether you do. Tell me. If we go to the council with just our claim, we might win. Probably will. But Hale loses one battle and moves on to the next family. If we go with 3 additional cases documented with the families standing behind them, it stops being a dispute about a timber sale. It becomes an investigation into systematic fraud. She met his eyes. Hale will not come quietly. He'll use everything he has. He'll come at me harder. He'll come at you. He may go after my father's property again through a different mechanism. I know, Nathaniel said. I need you to know it fully, not abstractly. Abigail. He said her name the way he always did, not as punctuation as something deliberate. I am not going to flinch. I want you to know that. I believe you, she said. I need to believe you haven't miscalculated how bad it can get. I haven't, he said. And neither have you, which is why we're going to do it anyway. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Then let's start with the Hendersons. They went together, which was itself a statement. The county would read and discuss, but neither of them had the patience for managing appearances anymore. They rode to the Henderson farm on a Thursday morning and sat in Margaret Henderson's kitchen, a small, anxious woman with careful eyes who kept looking at the door as though someone might come through it at any moment, and Abigail laid out what they knew. Margaret listened. Her husband, a large, quiet man named George, stood with his back against the wall the whole time. If we stand behind this, Margaret said when Abigail finished, and it doesn't go right. I know, Abigail said. I know what it costs if it fails. I'm asking you to weigh that against what it costs if you don't, and Hale moves the assessment on your loan next spring. Margaret looked at her husband. George looked at the floor. Then he looked at Nathaniel. You're backing this, George said. It wasn't a question. Fully, Nathaniel said. Your name on this filing? Yes. George was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at his wife. She gave him a look that Abigail recognized the look of a woman who had already made her decision and was waiting for her husband to catch up. All right, George said. The Prewitts took 2 visits and a great deal more persuasion. Thomas Prewitt was a cautious man who had built everything he had out of nothing and was constitutionally opposed to risk. But his wife Eleanor sat at the kitchen table on the second visit and said quietly and with absolute finality, Thomas, we say yes, or we spend the rest of our lives waiting for Hale to decide he's ready. And Thomas Prewitt looked at his wife and said nothing more and signed the affidavit. That was the 2nd week. The 3rd week was when Robert Hale stopped being indirect. It started with small things. A rumor circulating through the county that Abigail had forged documents in the original loan repayment. Then a version that she had borrowed money from Nathaniel to pay the loan, which would constitute a conflict of interest in the timber transaction. Neither rumor had a source anyone could name. Both spread with the organic efficiency of things that have been deliberately planted. She heard them through Martha Whitfield, who reported them with the loyal urgency of a woman who wanted to make sure Abigail knew what was being said before it reached her from a worse direction. "It's garbage," Martha said. "Yes," Abigail agreed. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing," Abigail said. "Not about the rumors directly. You answer rumors by making them irrelevant. If the evidence is clean enough, people stop caring what was said." But it was harder than she made it sound to Martha. Because the rumors were working, she could feel it in the subtle shifts of how people spoke to her in town, the slight recalibration in eyes. Not her close acquaintances. Not Ruth Alcott. Not Martha. But the outer ring, the people who didn't know her well enough to have an opinion, and were therefore available to someone else's. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that clearly and firmly and several times a day. It mattered. On a Tuesday, in the second week, she came home to find a notice tacked to the gatepost. Not a legal document. Hale was too careful for that. A handwritten notice unsigned, stating that the Carter property line survey from 1809 had been conducted in error, and that the eastern timber parcel might not in fact fall within the Carter deed. She stood at the gate and read it twice. Then she pulled it off the post, folded it, and walked inside. Her father was at this table. She handed him the notice. He read it. His face went the specific white it went when he was containing something large. "This is fabricated," he said. "Yes." "The survey was done by Aldous Pratt. He's been dead 12 years. They know there's no one to refute it." "We have the original survey document," she said. "And Pratt's son is still in the county. He helped his father on that survey. He remembers it." "You've already thought about this." "I thought about it at 3 a.m. 2 days ago," she said. "When I couldn't sleep. I was running through which parts of our documentation were vulnerable, and this was on the list." Her father looked at her for a long time. "How long have you been losing sleep over this?" "Since Alcott sent the filing notice." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you worrying more than you already were." Joseph Carter set the notice down and looked at his daughter with an expression that was complicated in the way of parents who see themselves in their children and are not entirely sure how they feel about what they've produced. "You've been carrying this alone again." "I have Nathaniel." "You've been carrying the part you're afraid to show Nathaniel," her father said quietly. "The part that's frightened." She was quiet. "You can be frightened, Abigail," he said. "It won't break anything." She sat down at the table. She pressed her hands flat against the wood. She said with a honesty that cost her more than she expected, "I'm afraid that if I let myself be frightened, it'll show. And if it shows, Hale wins. Because the moment I look like I'm not certain we'll hold the people we need behind us, we'll start looking for the exit." "And Nathaniel," her father said. She looked at the table. "Abigail, I'm afraid," she said very quietly, "that if he sees how frightened I am, he'll realize I'm not as strong as he thinks, and I need—" She stopped. Her father waited. "I need him to keep choosing this," she said. "I need him to keep being certain, because I am using his certainty to hold myself together right now, and I don't know what I do if it wavers." Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That man rode out to look at a lame horse on a farm he had no business visiting, and then sat in this kitchen and told me honestly that he didn't know exactly what he wanted yet, but he knew it had something to do with you. That's not a man who's going to waver." She looked at him. "You can let him see you're afraid," Joseph said. "That won't break him. Might actually do the opposite." She thought about that for a long time after he went to bed. When Nathaniel came the next morning, she met him at the gate and showed him the notice without preamble. He read it. His jaw set. He looked up. "Pratt's son," she said before he could speak. "I know. I was up at 3 a.m. 2 days ago going through the vulnerable points." He looked at her. Something in his expression changed. "You've been awake at 3 a.m. "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." She took a breath. "I didn't want you to think, Abigail." He said it quietly with an edge of something she hadn't heard from him before, not frustration, not impatience. Something more personal than either. We are in this together. That means the 3 in the morning part too, not just the documents. She held his gaze. I know, she said. I'm still learning how to do that. So am I, he said. We can learn it at the same time. She hadn't cried once through any of this. She was not going to start in the front yard at 8 in the morning. But she took a breath that was slightly unsteady, and he noticed and didn't comment on it. Only stepped a little closer, and they stood at the gate of her father's farm in the October morning and held the weight of the thing between them without anyone dropping it. We go see Pratt's son today, she said. Yes, he said. I'll drive. James Pratt was 63 years old, hard of hearing in his left ear, and possessed of a memory for surveying details that was almost unnatural. He sat in his chair and listened to what they needed and then said, I remember that survey, October of 1809. My father ran the eastern line twice because the creek marker had shifted. The Carter parcel goes 30 feet past where most people think it does. He looked at Nathaniel. You want that in an affidavit? Yes, sir, Nathaniel said. Then sit down. This'll take a while and I do it right or I don't do it. They sat. It took 2 hours. At the end, James Pratt signed his name in a hand that was surprisingly steady for a man his age and said, Whatever Hale's trying to pull, I hope you bury it. That's the intention, Abigail said. Good, he said. My father did honest work his whole life. I won't have his survey called into question by a moneylender with too much free time. They drove back in the late afternoon, the affidavit on the seat between them, and Nathaniel said without looking away from the road, I want to tell you something. All right, she said. I came to your barn that first time with a theory, he said. I had been watching you from across a room and exchanging letters with you, and I had a theory that you were different from what I'd been encountering, that you were real in a way I hadn't found in a long time. I was testing the theory. I know, she said. I'm not testing it anymore, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever happens at the hearing, whatever Hale manages to do or not do, I am not testing you. I am certain. She looked at the road ahead of them. The October light was amber and low, and the valley below them had turned all the colors of the season. Nathaniel, she said. Yes. I'm certain too, she said. I'm also afraid. Both things are true at once. I know, he said. That's how it is when it's real. The hearing was 4 days away when the largest hit came. It came in the form of a letter delivered not to her, but to Nathaniel. A letter from Thomas Hargrove, who had signed the original claim, and who apparently had been developing a conscience or possibly cold feet in the 3 weeks since. The letter was not an apology. It was an explanation which was almost worse because it laid out in careful and articulate detail exactly how much pressure Robert Hale had applied to persuade Hargrove to sign. The business interests, the veiled threats, the very specific amount of money that changed hands. Nathaniel came to her immediately. He handed her the letter without a word. She read it. Then she read it again. He's turning, she said. He's scared, Nathaniel said. Which is a kind of turning. Can we use it? If he'll testify to what's in this letter, we don't just win the hearing. We bring Hale's entire operation in front of the council. He paused. If he won't testify and we use the letter anyway, Hale's lawyer will argue it's unverified. Will he testify? I don't know. That depends on whether his conscience outweighs his interest. She thought about Thomas Hargrove, about his hall and the tall windows, and the way he had smiled at her the first summer evening, about the fact that he had signed a fraudulent claim against her and had apparently done it because someone had told him to, and he had not found a way to refuse. I'll go talk to him, she said. Nathaniel looked at her. Abigail, he's more likely to be honest with me than with you, she said. You're his equal. I'm the person he wronged. Those are very different conversations. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through the argument and not finding a counter. I'll go with you, he said. I'll wait outside. Yes, she said. That's right. She went to Hargrove Hall the following morning. Nathaniel waited with the horses at the gate. She went to the door alone. Thomas Hargrove answered himself, which told her he had been watching for someone and had not wanted a servant to see who arrived. He looked at her and went pale. Miss Carter, he said. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. "May I come in?" He let her in. They sat in the same hall where she had first seen Nathaniel across a crowded room, which felt significant in the way of things that complete their own circles. She set the letter on the table between them. He looked at it. He didn't touch it. "I wrote that in a moment of—" He stopped. "Conscience," she said. He looked at her. He was not a bad man, she thought. He was a man who had made a bad decision and was now sitting in a room with the consequences of it, and finding them considerably less comfortable than the decision had seemed at the time. "I signed that claim because Robert Hale told me the transaction was genuinely fraudulent," he said. "I had reason to believe him. He stopped again. "I have business dealings with Edmund Hale that I was not prepared to jeopardize." "I know," she said. "The claim isn't legitimate," he said. "I know that now. I should have looked more carefully before." "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "I'm not here to make you feel worse about what you did. I'm here because you wrote that letter, and that means you already know it was wrong. What I need to know is whether you're willing to stand in front of the council and say what you wrote." He looked at his hands. "The consequences for me are real," she said. "I know that too. I'm not asking you to pretend they aren't." "If I testify, Hale will—" "Yes," she said. "He will. Whatever you're imagining he'll do, assume it's accurate." Hargrove was quiet. "Here is what I can tell you," she said. "If Hale's operation is brought in front of the council fully, not just our claim, but the pattern of what he's done to 3 other families, he loses his position on the lending committee. Without that position, most of what he can do to you is considerably reduced. But that only happens if there are enough people willing to say what they know." She let that sit. "I can't promise you it'll be easy," she said. "I can't promise you it'll be clean. I can tell you that the 3 families, the Hendersons, the Prewitts, and mine, we're going to be in that hearing room regardless. We are standing up. The question is how many people stand with us." He looked at her for a long time. "You came yourself," he said finally. "You didn't send him." "This conversation needed to be between us," she said. "What you did was against me. Whether you fix it is between you and your own conscience. I came to make sure you had the chance to make the choice clearly." Thomas Hargrove sat in his own hall in the October morning and looked at the letter and looked at her and was quiet for longer than she could easily measure. Then he said, "I'll be there." She drove back to the gate where Nathaniel was waiting. She walked up to him and he looked at her face and said, "He'll testify." "Yes," she said. He let out a slow breath. "Then we have everything." "Almost," she said. "We still have to actually do it." "Are you ready?" he asked. She thought about 3 in the morning, and the ledger, and the documents, and her father's face, and the Prewitt children, and the Marsh family, already gone to Richmond, and the rumors in the dry goods store, and Thomas Hargrove's face just now when he said yes. "I've been ready," she said. "I've been ready my whole life for something I didn't know was coming." He looked at her with the full force of everything he had been building toward her for months. Not the composed measuring look, not the careful guarded look. The completely open look of a man who has stopped protecting himself against the possibility of being known. "I know," he said. "I know you have." She didn't look away. "Let's go," she said. The morning of the county council hearing arrived cold and clear. The first truly cold day of the autumn, and Abigail dressed in the best clothes she owned, which were not impressive, and put on her mother's pearl earrings, and stood in the kitchen, while her father looked at her with an expression he didn't have a name for. "Well," he said. "Don't," she said. "I was just going to say, you look like your mother," he said. She put her hand on his arm for a moment. Then she picked up the document folder and walked to the door. Nathaniel was already at the gate. He had come early. He was in his good coat, his hat in his hands, and when she came across the yard, he looked at her, the way he had looked at her that very first morning in the barn, like something had clarified. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. They drove to the county hall together, and behind them in 2 separate wagons came George and Margaret Henderson and Thomas and Eleanor Prewitt, with their eldest boy driving, and Joseph Carter in his good coat sitting very straight on the bench. And in the county hall in 3 hours, Robert Hale was going to find out what happened when the people he had miscalculated all walked through the same door at the same time. He had not seen it coming. That was his mistake. He had looked at Abigail Carter and seen a poor girl in a faded dress, and he had made every decision that followed based on that assessment. He had not understood what she was. He was about to. The county council hall held 40 people comfortably. By the time Abigail walked through the door that October morning, there were 63 inside and more trying to get in. She had not expected that. She stopped just past the threshold and took in the room, the familiar faces, the unfamiliar ones, the density of bodies and the quality of attention, which was different from the attention at a social gathering. This was the attention of people who had heard something was happening and had come to see whether it was true. Nathaniel was beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His presence beside her was its own statement, and everyone in that room read it the same way. She moved forward. Robert Hale was already seated at the front to the left. He had a lawyer with him, a man named Cresswell from the eastern counties, which told her immediately that Hale had spent money preparing for this, which meant he was more worried than he wanted anyone to know. Edmund was beside him, smaller and softer than his uncle, with the expression of a man who had been told this would be straightforward and was beginning to suspect he had been misled. Abigail sat at the table to the right. Nathaniel sat beside her. Judge Alcott, who was serving as the council's presiding officer for the hearing, took his place at the center and called the room to order with the particular authority of a man who had been doing it for 30 years and had no patience for rooms that didn't settle quickly. This room settled quickly. The council had 5 members besides Alcott. She knew 3 of them. Of those 3, 2 she trusted to be fair. 1 she wasn't sure about. She filed that information and held it. Cresswell opened for Hale. He was good, polished, confident, the kind of lawyer who understood that the first 5 minutes of any proceeding set the emotional temperature for everything that followed. He laid out the claim simply. The Carter-Brooks timber transaction had been conducted under inflated valuation. The documentation supporting that valuation had been prepared by a party with financial interest in the outcome, and the county council had an obligation to review any transaction that affected the integrity of the county lending record. It sounded reasonable. That was the most dangerous thing about it. It was designed to sound reasonable to people who didn't know the details, and most people in that room didn't know the details. She felt the room shift slightly. Not against her, but uncertain, which was what Cresswell wanted. Alcott looked at her. "Miss Carter, your response." She stood. She had thought about this moment for 3 weeks. She had written out what she intended to say, and then thrown it away, because she was not a woman who spoke from prepared text, and she knew instinctively that anything that sounded prepared in front of this crowd would lose them. These were her neighbors. They needed to hear her, not a performance of her. The timber on the eastern Carter parcel was assessed at its fair market value, she said. I have 3 comparable sales from neighboring properties in the last 18 months that establish that value. I have the original survey documentation, confirming the parcel boundaries, supported by an affidavit from James Pratt, who assisted his father in conducting that survey in 1809, and remembers it clearly. I have the ledger record of every dollar in the loan repayment, which was made from the timber sale from my family's savings and from income earned through my own labor. Not 1 cent came from Mr. Brooks. The transaction was clean. The claim against it is not. She paused. And that is actually the smaller part of what I have to say today. The room stirred. Cresswell looked up. The claim filed against this transaction was signed by Thomas Hargrove, she said. Mr. Hargrove is present today and has provided a sworn statement to the council explaining the circumstances under which he signed. I would ask that statement be entered into the record. Alcott nodded. The statement was entered. Robert Hale's expression did not change, but his lawyer leaned toward him and said something quickly and quietly, and Hale's hand on the table pressed flat and still in the way of a man applying deliberate control to himself. In addition, Abigail said, I am presenting documentation regarding the lending practices of the Hale operation across 3 additional families in this county. The Hendersons, the Prewitts, and the family of David Marsh, who is no longer in this county, but whose departure I believe the council will find was not in fact voluntary. The room was not quiet anymore. It was the specific controlled noise of 63 people, all reacting at different volumes and choosing different amounts of restraint. Alcott brought the room back. "Continue, Miss Carter." She continued. She had been afraid 3 weeks ago that she would not be able to hold her voice steady in front of this many people. She was not afraid of much, but public exposure of a kind that required absolute certainty, while being watched by people who were waiting for her to waver, that had kept her awake. That had been in the 3 a.m. inventory of things she was managing. She was not afraid now. Something had happened between the door of this room and this moment. Some final piece of the fear had converted itself into fuel, and she stood at that table in her best dress and her mother's pearl earrings, and spoke with the clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose by telling the truth. She laid out the pattern, the variable repayment triggers, the land assessments, Hale-controlled, the timeline of the Marsh property, and how it aligned with a loan review Edmund had conducted 4 months before. She did not editorialize. She did not reach for emotion. She presented the sequence of events and let the room draw its own conclusions, because conclusions drawn by the audience were worth 3 times what conclusions drawn by the speaker were worth. When she sat down, the room was different than when she had stood up. Cresswell requested a recess. Alcott denied it. Hale's lawyer stood and tried to reframe, argued the Marsh documentation was circumstantial, argued the Henderson and Prewitt cases were separate matters outside the scope of the current hearing, argued that Miss Carter was introducing irrelevant material to distract from the specific claim at issue. I was not wrong on the technical point. The other cases were strictly speaking outside scope. Abigail had known this. Alcott had known this when he agreed to let the documentation be submitted. The question was whether the council would agree to consider it anyway. Alcott looked at the 5 council members. He gave them a moment. Then he said, "The council will take a brief recess to consider the scope question." They filed out. The room noise immediately doubled. Abigail sat very still and breathed and did not look at Robert Hale. Nathaniel leaned toward her and said quietly, "You were extraordinary." "Don't," she said. "Not yet." "I know," he said. "I just needed to say it." She looked at him. He looked back with complete steadiness, and she took some of that steadiness into herself, the way you take heat from a fire when you're cold, and held it. Behind them, George Henderson said something to his wife in a low voice. Eleanor Prewitt had her arm through her husband's. Her father was sitting 2 rows back, with his hands on his knees and his jaw set. The council returned in 12 minutes. Alcott spoke. "The council has determined that given the systemic nature of the documentation presented, the full scope of evidence submitted by Miss Carter will be considered as context for evaluating the original claim's validity and the broader conduct of the Hale lending operation within this county." Cresswell stood immediately. "The council does not have authority." "The council has the authority it says it has," Alcott said with the particular mild certainty of a man who has not raised his voice in 30 years of proceedings because he has never needed to. "Mr. Cresswell, sit down." Cresswell sat down. Robert Hale, for the first time since Abigail had walked into that room, looked at her directly. Not with the pleasant assessment he'd offered at her kitchen door. Not with the casual condescension of the dry goods store. With something that had no pleasantness in it at all. She held his look without moving. He looked away first. Thomas Hargrove testified next. He was not comfortable doing it. Abigail could see the discomfort in every line of him. The careful way he stood, the controlled pace of his speech, the specific effort of a man telling the truth about something that reflected poorly on himself in a room full of people who knew him. He did it anyway. He described the pressure Hale had applied. He described what had changed hands. He described signing the claim and why, and his voice was steady enough. When he finished, he did not look at Hale. He looked at Abigail briefly with an expression she didn't try to name, and she gave him a small nod, because that was what the moment required, and he sat down. George Henderson testified. Simple and direct, the way a farmer tells the truth without ornament in the order things happened. The assessment change. The notice. The calculation he and Margaret had done at the kitchen table, trying to figure out whether there was any way to make the numbers work. There wasn't. He had not cried. He described it factually, and it was worse for the facts. Eleanor Prewitt testified for her family, because Thomas could not quite bring himself to do it, and everyone in the room understood why without being told. She was a small woman, and her voice carried with the particular authority of someone who has nothing to protect except the truth. She said near the end, "We have 5 children. I need this council to understand that when I say we could not afford what Mr. Hale was preparing to do to our loan, I mean there was no version in which my children were not harmed. I need that to be in the record." "It's in the record," Alcott said. Cresswell attempted to discredit each witness. He was skilled, and he landed some blows. The Henderson testimony had a gap in dates that he exposed, and the Prewitt loan documentation had one page that was difficult to read clearly. But the pattern was too broad and too consistent. You could pick at one thread. You could not unravel the whole cloth. The moment the hearing broke open completely came when Alcott called Edmund Hale to respond to the specific claim about the Carter transaction. Edmund stood. He was visibly uncomfortable, and Abigail understood watching him that Edmund had not fully known the scope of what his uncle had been doing. He had known enough. He had participated. But the Marsh documentation, the Henderson pattern, the Prewitt timeline, some of that was new to him. She could see it in his face, and it was landing hard. He gave a short answer about the transaction claim. Technically accurate vague where it needed to be vague. Then Alcott said, "Mr. Hale, were you aware of the variable assessment trigger in the Henderson loan agreement?" Edmund looked at his uncle. Robert Hale gave him nothing. No guidance, no signal. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his face arranged in a careful blankness. Edmund looked back at Alcott. "I was aware of the structure," he said. "I was not aware of how it had been applied." The room understood what that meant. Edmund had just separated himself from his uncle in front of 63 witnesses and a formal record. Whether it was conscience or self-preservation, the effect was the same. The united front had cracked, and everyone heard it crack. Cresswell's shoulders moved slightly. A small adjustment. The posture of a lawyer recalculating. Robert Hale's expression did not change, but his hand on the table was no longer flat. The fingers had curled slightly, and Abigail, watching him, thought, "There it is. There is the first real thing he has shown in this room." Alcott gave Nathaniel the floor. Nathaniel stood. He was not a man who made speeches, and he did not make one now. He said in the plain, deliberate way. He said things that mattered. "I purchased timber from Miss Carter at a fair price that she determined, and that comparable sales support. I did so because the timber was worth it, and because I am a man who pays what things are worth. The claim against that transaction has no merit, and was filed for reasons this council has now heard documented in detail." He paused. "I would also like to say for the record that I have known Miss Carter for 4 months. In that time, I have not met a more honest person in this county or any other. If the council has any remaining question about the integrity of this transaction, I suggest they consider the source of the claim against it and ask themselves what that source had to gain." He sat down. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when the weight of a thing has finally settled to the floor and everyone is feeling it land. Alcott looked at the council members. There was a brief murmured exchange. Then he straightened. "The council finds the claim against the Carter-Brooks timber transaction to be without merit. The claim is dismissed." He paused, and his voice did not change in volume or tone, but something in it did change. Something that had been held carefully in professional restraint released slightly. "The council further finds that the documentation submitted regarding the Hale lending operation warrants a formal investigation into practices affecting the Henderson, Prewitt, and Marsh properties. That investigation will be conducted by this council beginning the first week of November. Mr. Hale, both of you will receive formal notice by end of week." Robert Hale stood. "This council does not have the authority." "Mr. Hale," Alcott said, "I've been on this council for 31 years. Don't tell me what I have the authority to do." Hale looked around the room. 63 people looked back at him. His lawyer touched his arm and said something. Hale sat down slowly, like a man who was choosing to sit rather than admitting he had to. And that was the moment. Not dramatic, not loud. Just a man sitting down in a room where he had expected to be able to stand as long as he wanted, and finding that he couldn't anymore. Abigail sat very still and let the verdict arrive. She had won. They had won. The farm was safe. The Henderson and Pruitt families had a path forward. The Marsh documentation was in the record. Hale's operation was going to be investigated by the county council, which meant that whatever he did next, he was going to be doing it while being watched. She had known the documents were solid. She had known the case was strong. But knowing a thing and feeling it arrive are different, and she sat at that table and felt it arrive and did not make a sound, because the feeling was too large and too complicated for a sound. It was relief and exhaustion and grief for the 3 weeks of 3 in the morning fear, and something else underneath all of it that was quieter and more permanent than any of the rest. Her father was beside her. She hadn't heard him move from his row, but he was there, his hand on her shoulder, brief and firm, and she covered it with hers for a moment. "Ma's trees are still ours," she said. "Yes," her father said. "They are." Outside the hall in the cold October air, the county rearranged itself. It did not do so quietly. 63 people exiting a proceeding of that nature generate considerable noise, conversation, and argument, and the particular social energy of people who have witnessed something they will be talking about for years, recounting it to people who weren't there. Abigail stood on the steps and breathed cold air and felt the noise move around her. Margaret Henderson found her and took both her hands and said simply, "Thank you." George stood behind his wife with his hat in his hands and nodded once, and Abigail nodded back, and that was enough, because it was the kind of gratitude that didn't need words to carry the weight. Eleanor Pruitt hugged her, which startled her because Eleanor was not a woman who hugged casually. "Come to supper next week," Eleanor said. "All of you. Thomas wants to say things properly." "We'll come," Abigail said. Martha Whitfield appeared at her elbow. "I need you to know," Martha said, "that everything I said in the last 3 weeks was accurate, and everything the other side said was garbage, and I would like it noted that I never once repeated the forgery rumor." "It's noted," Abigail said. "Good." Martha squeezed her arm and moved off to begin what would clearly be an extremely thorough version of the morning's events, delivered to everyone who hadn't been present. Ruth Alcott came last. She said nothing. She looked at Abigail for a moment with the specific expression of a woman who has seen a great deal in her life and is still capable of being moved by the right thing. Then she patted her cheek once the way a woman touches something she's proud of and walked back toward the hall. Nathaniel found her when the crowd had thinned. He came and stood beside her, and for a moment they both looked at the empty road and said nothing. Then he said, "How are you?" "Tired," she said. "Relieved. Afraid it isn't real yet." "It's real," he said. "I know. I just need another hour before it feels that way." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I meant what I said in there. About the timber. About you being the most honest person I've met in this county or any other." He turned to look at her. She turned too. "And about everything else. Everything that isn't in the record." She looked at him. The cold October air was sharp, and the light was the low gold of late morning, and his face was completely open, the way she had come to know it was when he was going to say something true. "I know," she said. "I want to say it properly," he said. "Not in a courtroom, not in your father's kitchen. I want to say it, Nathaniel." "Yes. Say it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, and without any surrounding ceremony, "I love you. I have been working my way toward saying that since the first morning in that barn, and I am finished working my way toward it." The road was quiet. Her father was somewhere behind them talking with Alcott. The county was reassembling itself in the aftermath of something that had shifted its shape. She said, "I love you too. I have been being careful about it for 4 months, and I am finished being careful." He looked at her with the full, unguarded expression of a man who has been alone for 3 years and has just been handed back something he thought he had lost permanently. "I have something to ask you," he said. "I know," she said. "Will you?" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "You didn't let me finish. You were going to ask me to marry you." "I was." "Then yes," she said. "The answer is yes. I've known it was yes for 6 weeks. I was waiting until the timing wasn't terrible." He looked at her. Then he did something she had seen from him only in pieces and glimpses. He smiled. Not the controlled, slight expression that passed for a smile in public. A real one, full and unguarded, the smile of a man who has forgotten to protect himself and doesn't miss the protection. "The timing is still not ideal," he said. "We're standing on courthouse steps." "I've made do with the worst conditions," she said. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. His hand was warm around hers, and steady, the way he was steady, the way she had learned to rely on that steadiness without losing her own. "There is one condition," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "I run the eastern parcel myself," she said. "My decisions, my management. You can have opinions, and I will hear them. But the decisions are mine." "I would expect nothing else," he said. "And my father stays in his house as long as he wants." "Of course. And if I decide at some point that this county needs a proper lending library with honest records that aren't subject to Hale's cousins deciding who gets access, you will not tell me it's impractical." He looked at her for a moment. "A lending library. The Prewitts have children who can't afford books. The Henderson boys are sharp and have no access to anything to sharpen themselves against. This county's problem is not a shortage of good people. It's a shortage of institutions that treat good people as though they matter." She looked at him steadily. "I intend to build one." "Then we'll build one," he said. "I'll build one," she said. "You can help." He looked at her with the complete particular expression she had no name for, that was specific to him, and that she was going to spend the rest of her life seeing across tables and in doorways and in the particular morning light of whatever their life became. "Yes," he said. "That's right." Her father appeared at her shoulder. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at their joined hands. He looked at his daughter. "Well," he said. "Pa," she said. I was quiet for a moment. Then he said to Nathaniel, "You'll take care of her." "With respect, Mr. Carter," Nathaniel said, "I think we've established that she takes care of herself. I intend to take care beside her. There's a difference." Joseph Carter looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across his face, something that was not quite the expression of a man who has decided to approve, but was close enough to be indistinguishable. "Humph," he said. He put his hat on. He walked down the steps toward the wagon. "That's a yes," Abigail said. "I know," Nathaniel said. She looked out at the road. Her father's farm was at the end of it, the 42 acres, the house, the barn, the well, the peach trees her mother had planted the year she was born. Safe. Still theirs. The lending library would be 3 years in building. She would argue with the county council twice about the location and win both times. The Prewitt boys, all 3 of them, would be among its first regular patrons, and the eldest would read every book on land law she could source and grow up to become the first attorney from the southern end of the county, which was not something she planned, but was deeply satisfying. The Hale investigation would run through the winter and conclude in March. Robert Hale would lose his position on the lending committee. Edmund would cooperate with the council and receive reduced consequences, which Abigail did not consider justice, but accepted as the practical outcome of complex systems. The Marsh family came back the following spring and recovered most of what they had lost, which was the piece of it she was most glad of. Thomas Hargrove came to their wedding in December and stood in the back and did not presume to sit near the front, which showed appropriate judgment. She acknowledged him on the way out. He nodded. That was the end of it. But all of that was later. Right now, it was October, cold and gold and clear, and Abigail Carter was standing on courthouse steps with her hand in Nathaniel Brooks's hand and her father walking ahead of them down the road, and the county was reassembling itself around a different shape than it had held that morning, and everything that had been in the balance was settled. She had walked into a room full of people who expected her to disappear. She had not disappeared. She had stood at a window and held still and turned around, and the man who tested 30 women and found them all wanting had been there listening and had eventually followed her into a barn and drunk bad coffee in a kitchen and written 20 letters about easement disputes and timber and 3 in the morning fears, and she had answered every one. She had not been looking for him. She had been looking for $73 and a way to save the peach trees. She had found considerably more than that. "Ready," he said. She squeezed his hand once, looked at the road, looked at the October light on everything she had fought to keep and everything she had not expected to gain. "Yes," she said, and she walked forward, not away from what she'd been, but into what she had always been, becoming a woman who had carried hard things until she didn't have to carry them alone, who had been careful until the right moment to stop, who had stood in rooms that tried to make her small and had simply quietly refused, and that refusal had been the truest and most unbreakable thing about her all along.